Mr. Richardson, are you sure you can solve this equation?
A strict professor tried to catch a new student off guard, expecting him to falter. Instead, she ended up revealing her own bias to the entire class. The lecture hall was quiet, save for the steady sound of chalk scratching across the board. Dr. Margaret Whitmore, a seasoned faculty member at Stanford, moved with deliberate precision as she outlined a complex calculus equation before turning to face her students. Her sharp eyes swept across the room, lingering just a bit longer on a new face seated near the back. Jamal, whose families contributed generously to the university, whose futures in academia seemed guaranteed. Jamal sat silently, notebook open, pen tapping a steady beat against the page. Unlike the others, he wasn't scrambling to write everything down. He simply watched. That irritated her. She crossed her arms. "Since we have a new addition," she said to the class, "perhaps Mr. Richardson would like to introduce himself." A few students glanced his way, some curious, others trying to hide their amusement. Jamal looked up. "I'm Jamal Richardson. I transferred from Howard." That was it. No extra commentary, no effort to impress. Dr. Whitmore forced a tight-lipped smile. "Well, I hope you're ready. This course isn't easy. I assume you've completed the prerequisites." "I have," he said calmly, voice steady. She decided to press further. "Since you're here, let's see where you stand," she said, pointing to the equation. "Can you tell me the first step to solving this?" A wave of whispers passed through the class. It wasn't unheard of to challenge someone on day one. But it was typically reserved for students a professor doubted. Everyone picked up on the implication. Jamal, however, showed no reaction. He leaned forward, studied the equation briefly, then answered smoothly. "You'd start with a partial fraction decomposition," he said, "but considering the structure, a Laplace transform would be more effective." The room fell completely silent. Dr. Whitmore's fingers tensed slightly. He was right. Still, she wasn't going to be thrown off that easily. "An unconventional method," she replied carefully, "but let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll see how your strategies hold up under pressure." She returned her focus to the board, but the moment had already landed. The students noticed. Some exchanged looks, others whispered quietly. She needed to re-establish authority. "All right," she said briskly. "Let's move on." But even as she continued, a thought stuck with her. This wasn't over, and Jamal knew it too. He was ready. Dr. Whitmore continued teaching, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Jamal. His answer had come too easily, too accurately. She'd seen students like him before, ones who walked in thinking they were exceptional, that they could challenge the way she ran her class. Not this time. She kept scanning the room as she lectured, her eyes returning to him again and again. Jamal remained calm, pen tapping lightly against his notes. He wasn't showing off, wasn't arrogant, wasn't trying to prove himself, and somehow, that bothered her more than anything else. She adjusted her glasses and faced the class again. "Let's see who's been paying attention," she said. "What's the real-world application of this transformation?" Hands shot up, mostly from the front row, the usual students. She ignored them. "Mr. Richardson?" Jamal glanced up from his notebook. A few heads turned. She had called on him again. She gave a stiff nod and turned away. "Moving on," she said, refusing to acknowledge the response. Jamal exhaled and leaned back in his chair. This was familiar. Professors who expected him to fail, who targeted him, pushed him harder than others, waiting for the misstep. He had navigated these situations for years. He knew exactly what this was, but he wasn't going to play into it. Dr. Whitmore, though, wasn't finished. She continued the lesson for the next hour, sprinkling questions throughout. But more often than not, they landed on Jamal. The questions kept some smirking, others shifting awkwardly in their seats. Even those who had found it amusing at first began to realize what was really going on. Jamal, however, remained composed. He answered each question without delay, without frustration, without emotion. If anything, he seemed unaffected, and that only made her angrier. By the end of the class, she was no closer to catching him off balance than when she'd started. She capped her marker and faced the students. "We'll continue from here next time. Read chapters 4 and 5 before Monday." Chairs scraped the floor as students packed up their belongings. A few stayed behind, whispering quietly. Jamal slid his notebook into his backpack and stood up. As he reached the door, Dr. Whitmore called out, "Mr. Richardson." Jamal met her eyes, unreadable. "I study." There was a pause. She didn't like that answer. "Well," she said coolly, "let's hope you can keep up." Then she turned her back on him, ending the conversation without another word. Jamal didn't respond. He nodded once and walked out, but she wasn't the only one watching. Someone else had taken notice, and before long, she would regret underestimating him. The next class was full. Word had spread. Dr. Whitmore had targeted Jamal, and he hadn't blinked. Now the students were curious. Would she challenge him again? Would he slip up this time? Or was there something long, intricate expressions stretching across it, the kind that made even the top students hesitate? She capped the marker and turned around. "All right," she said, scanning the room. "This problem will require everything we've covered. It's advanced, time-intensive, even professionals struggle with it." She paused, then locked eyes with Jamal. "Mr. Richardson," she said, her voice smooth and deliberate, "since you seem eager to participate, why don't you give it a try?" The room went quiet. Jamal placed his pen down. His face didn't change, but his posture shifted. A quiet readiness settling over him. A few students glanced at each other. Some smirked, sensing a setup. Others looked uncomfortable. They all knew what was happening. This wasn't just a question. This was a test. Eyes locked on him. He examined the board for a few seconds. Then, without hesitation, he picked up the marker and began to write. Not slowly, not tentatively, with confidence. At first, the room was still. Then, students began to notice. The way his hand moved across the board, smooth, precise. He wasn't stopping to think. He wasn't second-guessing. He was solving it. The whispers started. "Wait, is he actually— Hold on, I thought this was supposed to be impossible," Jamal continued, line after line, refining, restructuring, eliminating everything unnecessary. Now, the entire class, undeniably correct. A thick silence hung in the air. One student whispered, "No way." Another stared at the board, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. And Dr. Whitmore, for the first time, looked uncertain. She stepped closer, eyes scanning his work, searching for a mistake, an oversight, anything she could critique. But there was nothing. It was flawless. Jamal remained quiet. He didn't boast, didn't smirk. He simply waited. Dr. Whitmore slowly turned to him. Her face gave nothing away, but her eyes told the truth. She had misjudged him badly. And worse, the entire class had seen it. She cleared her throat. Jamal glanced over and saw a man he didn't recognize. Mid-50s, sharply dressed, radiating presence. Murmurs stirred across the room. "Wait, That's Dr. Adler, the MIT professor." Dr. Whitmore's posture stiffened. She hadn't expected him to speak. Dr. Adler stepped forward, first looking at the board, then at Jamal. His expression wasn't surprised. It was impressed. "I'd call it exceptional," he said. And just like that, the entire balance of power in the room shifted. A ripple of awe swept through the students. This wasn't just any guest. Dr. Adler was a heavyweight, a renowned mathematician from MIT, celebrated for his work in applied calculus and complex theoretical modeling, and he was eyes scanning the solution. He tapped a section with his knuckle. "This part here," he said. "Most students would need 3 or 4 extra steps to reach it. But you skipped the redundant transformations." Jamal gave a small shrug. Seemed inefficient. Dr. Adler let out a low chuckle. "It was, but I haven't seen many students spot that, especially not on the fly." More murmurs echoed around them. Dr. Whitmore's hands curled at her sides. She could feel control slipping through her fingers. "Mr. Richardson," she cut in, voice tight. "This isn't a competition. All methods are valid in this classroom." Dr. Adler turned to her, expression calm but direct. "Of course," he said, others simply stunned. Dr. Whitmore forced a strained smile. "Yes, well, one good answer doesn't make a mathematician." Dr. Adler raised an eyebrow. I'd say it's a good start. He turned back to Jamal. Where'd you learn to think like that? Jamal held his gaze. My dad, he said plainly. He's an engineer. Taught me when I was a kid, told me to always find the simplest path before solving anything. Dr. Adler nodded. Smart man. Jamal returned the nod subtly. Dr. Whitmore was losing ground fast, and she could feel it. She had to reclaim the class. Well, she said briskly, erasing the board, that was an interesting exercise. Let's get back. Jamal blinked. What? Dr. Adler shrugged. You have a rare way of thinking. We could use minds like yours. The whispers erupted again. Jamal stared, unsure what to say. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward quickly. Dr. Adler, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. He turned to her, unfazed. So is talent like this? Gasps slipped out from a few students. Jamal kept his expression still, but inside something shifted. He'd spent years proving himself. Years facing people like Dr. Whitmore, those who expected him to fall short. But now, in front of everyone, he was being offered something he'd never dared to imagine. A real opportunity. He cast one final glance at Dr. Whitmore. Margaret, he said, his voice smooth with a hint of amusement. Looks like you misjudged this one. And then he walked out. The class would never look at her the same again, and she knew it. Dr. Whitmore stood frozen, her grip tightening around the marker in her hand. The room felt different now. Her authority, once unshakable, was slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. Students were still watching. Some stared at Jamal. Some stared at her. A few exchanged glances, quiet smirks forming at the corners of their mouths. She had spent years commanding respect in this very hall. But in just a few minutes, a student she had dismissed, one she'd tried to corner, had dismantled the image she had so carefully cultivated and slid Dr. Adler's card into his pocket without a word. Dr. Whitmore cleared her throat. All right, she said, forcing her usual authoritative tone. That's enough distraction for today. Let's get back to the material. But no one was really listening. The shift had already happened. She pushed through the rest of the lecture, writing out equations, trying to carry on as though nothing had changed. But the energy in the room was gone. Students whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. A few exchanged knowing looks in Jamal's direction. And Jamal, he just sat there, calm and focused, completely unbothered. That, more than anything, got under her skin. By the end of class, she dismissed them with a curt, "See you next week," before he spoke. Professor? She glanced up, her expression still rigid. Yes, Mr. Richardson. He studied her for a moment, then said, calmly, too calmly, I know what you were trying to do. Her face didn't change. Excuse me? You wanted me to fail, he said plainly. You kept pushing, waiting for me to trip up. But I didn't. Her jaw tightened. You're imagining things. Jamal tilted his head. Am I? She held his gaze, and for the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar in her own classroom. Unease. Jamal exhaled through his nose and gave a small shake of his head. I've been through this before. People assuming I'm not enough. Then, this time people saw it. And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, still clutching her marker like it was the only thing anchoring her. For the first time in years, she was no longer the most respected presence in the room, and she hated it. Dr. Whitmore sat in silence long after the door closed behind him. The classroom, once her domain, where her word had been final, now felt smaller. The truth was undeniable. She had underestimated him, not just his intellect, but his resilience. And worst of all, she hadn't just revealed her bias to him. She had revealed it to everyone. The whispers wouldn't stop. Students talked, faculty talked, and Dr. Adler. He had made sure she knew just how wrong she had been. That night, some attempt to reframe what had happened. But there was nothing to say. No version of the story made her look anything but wrong. Predictably, embarrassingly wrong. Meanwhile, Jamal sat in his dorm, staring down at Dr. Adler's card. He flipped it between his fingers, still processing everything. He had walked into that classroom prepared to be tested. He dealt with people like Dr. Whitmore before. But this time was different. This time, he hadn't just proven himself. He had been seen. He pulled out his phone and dialed. The call picked up almost immediately, one that had taken him years to truly believe. His talent spoke for itself, and no one, not even someone like Dr. Whitmore, could take that away. Because no matter how many people try to diminish you, the truth always finds its way to the surface. And when it does, the only thing left to do is shine. If you've ever felt underestimated, doubted, or overlooked, remember this: your talent is yours. No one can take it from you. Keep pushing. Keep proving them wrong. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more.